Our Bible study today is on Daniel chapter 5, beginning at verse 14. Let us pray. Lord, as we continue through the book of Daniel and we hear how Daniel in his old age brought about the judgment for King Belshazzar through his arrogance, we pray that you would help us to recognize the ways in which we sometimes put ourselves above you by making decisions without prayer, by believing that we're in control of our lives or that we're the center of our own universe. Help us, Lord, to submit and to humble ourselves before you and to receive your blessings through your Son Jesus, who was the only one who was able to completely be humble before you, Lord, as he became a servant and suffered even death so that he might save us. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so in this middle part of the book of Daniel, chapter 5, we're in the section after the writing on the wall occurred. Belshazzar was having a dinner party. And remember, this is on the eve of the destruction of the city of Babylon. And he was the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar. He was, his father Nabonidus had kind of abdicated the throne by moving to Taman, which is in Arabia, because he didn't really want to rule, or he also got himself in trouble probably with the religious leaders of the city because he wanted to set the moon god above Marduk or Bel, who was kind of like the Zeus of the Babylonian pantheon, and Belshazzar is having this dinner party. The city is about to be destroyed. It's being surrounded by the Persian Empire, and he's just having this giant party, and he's getting drunk. And it's in the midst of this that this writing on the wall occurs with a mysterious hand. And when we get to that section, we'll be able to see how the writing it was mysterious, even though it seems kind of strange. Why couldn't they read it? Why didn't they understand it? Well, there was, there's some reasons for that when we get to it. But in his desire to learn about what it said, he kind of didn't even consider Daniel, right? The only person who, in the history of the Babylonian Empire, was able to interpret the previous king's dreams. Well, mostly it was Nebuchadnezzar. And so that's what the first part of the book of Daniel is about. Now you got this grandson of Daniel, and he doesn't even consider Daniel, right? In the beginning of the section, it says, he had verse 5, when the finger of a human hand appeared and wrote this on the wall. And then in verse 7, he calls for the enchanters, astrologers, and diviners. And he basically only calls the Babylonian versions of the wise men because he has such a kind of a disgust and a derision for the Jewish people, that the idea that Daniel could do this isn't something he's even willing to admit. And the only reason he eventually gives in to the idea is because it says the queen, but most likely it was the queen mother, because she knew who Daniel was, because she was probably one of Nebuchadnezzar's daughters, and so it was probably his mother. Okay, and that was in verse 10. So, and then we left off, last week we included verse 13, how Daniel was brought before the king, and the king said to him, "Are you Daniel of the exiles my father the king brought from Judah?" So notice that he actually identifies Daniel as one of the exiles who my father, no, it wasn't really his father, but by identifying him as the son of Nebuchadnezzar. And we can see this throughout the Old Testament, that the word son of often means descendant of, but it also denotes the character. So by saying that Belshazzar calling himself the son of Nebuchadnezzar, not saying that he's the biological son, but he's like in the same cloth, right? He is as powerful as like remember the vision of the gold-headed statue, and then Daniel had told in Daniel chapter 2 that Nebuchadnezzar, you are the gold head. So basically, he's trying to claim, I'm as great as my grandfather, Nebuchadnezzar, and calling himself the son of may have been part of his arrogance, right? because maybe in a way, he wanted to skip his own father, Nabonidus, because he had kind of left the city and tried to move the capital to another place because he didn't want to face the religious leaders. So here, Belshazzar is like he was more like a governor of the city at the time, but he's making claims of himself that are disproportionate to his actual authority. Okay, so in verse 14, somebody read that?
I have heard of you that the Spirit of the gods is in you, and that light and understanding and excellent wisdom are found in you.
So, I mean, that sounds like Belshazzar it sounds positive, right? It sounds like he's saying, oh yeah, look at Daniel, you were so great. But hidden within that verse, there are some ways in which he is showing derision and disrespect to Daniel. I don't know if you caught it. So what are some things that he said in verse 14 that shows King Belshazzar's not actually believing that Daniel is who he says he is?
I've heard.
Okay, so why is the phrase "I have heard"? That you have this intelligence and wisdom. Why is that a derision?
Well, he's not saying that he himself thinks that.
Right. Okay, so first of all, Belshazzar, we know that he knows who Daniel is because he just said, "Oh, you're the one that my father, the king, brought from Judah." So it's not like he didn't know who Daniel was. He's familiar with him. So he would also have been familiar with what other aspects of Daniel's life in Babylon. The correct interpretation, the fact that his grandfather had also known Daniel and had been judged by Daniel's God, became like a wild animal, and yet he saw these things and he knew of these things, and now he's not even claiming that they're real. Oh, I've only heard of these things. It's kind of crazy that instead of saying, I know you did these things, he says, I've only heard of them. So he's actually distancing himself from Daniel, almost like claiming, yeah, you're not all that special. I don't really believe the things that people have said about you. When in fact, he may not have seen it with his own eyes because maybe he was born after. We don't know for sure if he was born after Nebuchadnezzar had his insanity, but we certainly know that he would have known growing up about his father's life and how the kingdom had disintegrated underneath him after, because what happens is Nabonidus started a rebellion to try to take the throne from Nebuchadnezzar. So basically it was it wasn't his former glory had been diminished by people turning against him. Okay, and then another aspect of his derision is in the second half of that sentence, where he says, "The spirit of the gods." Now, what did the queen mother just say? If you look up at verse 10, she's talking about Daniel. Okay, and she defines him or describes him in a different way.
Yeah. She says, "There is a man in your kingdom in whom is the spirit of the holy gods."
Okay, so
she's saying that.
So there's a different word that she adds that Belshazzar doesn't. Yeah, right. So in essence, his mother, or the queen mother, is saying Daniel has the spirit of the holy gods. In Aramaic, you can actually translate that as he has holy spirits. And she's slightly wrong because he doesn't have the Holy Spirits. He has the Holy Spirit of God, the only true God. And so she acknowledged that the God of Israel was the one who gave Daniel his ability to interpret. But by rejecting the word holy, he's basically saying, you might have some power from some so-called gods of Judah, but he's not acknowledging that the God of Judah actually has any existence, or that he doesn't have any power, or Daniel isn't holy. So just by eliminating that one word from the way his mother had described Daniel, is proof that he doesn't have a high view of Daniel. Okay?
There's the plural too. That's always
Well, that's only because they're pagans, and none of them believed.
all kinds of gods,
Right, yeah, they believed in lots of gods, right? So first of all, they thought of all the country, every country has a god, and their country's gods are the greatest gods, right? So Marduk is the greatest god, and his name Belshazzar is named after May Bel, which is the same name as Marduk. May Bel protect the king, so that's what his name means, Belshazzar. And so he thinks that the God of Israel is, sure the God exists, because they never doubted that other countries' gods existed, but he's not going to ever acknowledge that the God of Israel has any power. And notice that what this chapter is actually doing is contrasting, and this is our second question on the study guide. How does Belshazzar contrast to Nebuchadnezzar in the previous chapter in ways that they prayed, and also in ways that Daniel addresses the king? So in this section that we're looking at, the way that Belshazzar addresses Daniel, and that Daniel addresses him, it's showing the contrast between the previous chapter and this chapter. So in chapter 4, Nebuchadnezzar, what was the conclusion to the way that Nebuchadnezzar talked about Yahweh, the God of Israel?
The king of heaven.
Yeah, he called him the king of heaven, and he said that God had all power, and this is back in chapter 4, verse 35. He talks about how all people of the earth are regarded as nothing. He, that is God of Israel, does as he pleases, and with the powers of heaven, all the peoples of earth, no one can hold back his hand or say to him, what have you done? So he's basically acknowledging that the God of Israel was the greatest God of all the gods. He didn't say he was the only God. But his grandson doesn't even want to acknowledge that. So in essence, he's right. His grandfather learned the lesson the hard way. He became insane, but then he came out of it when he said, oh, Israel's God is the greatest God. Now we see that this judgment's going to come upon him. If he would have repented, maybe things would have turned out differently. But ultimately, God knows the heart of Belshazzar is irreconcilable, that he is completely consumed with pride. Can you think of another person in the biblical history where the father, he made some mistakes, but then the son was even worse, and then he was deposed by God because of his arrogance? Who's the wisest king in the Bible? Solomon. And who was the most foolish king in the Bible? Solomon's son. His son's name was Rehoboam. And Rehoboam, what was the punishment that God gave to him because of his arrogance?
He lost more than half the kingdom.
That's right. This kingdom split, right? And it wasn't because that there was if when you read through the text, you might come to the conclusion that it sounds like, the people elected a new king. No, what happened was they seceded because they hated Rehoboam, the 10 tribes to the north, and they took on the name Israel because one of the biggest, because they were the majority of the tribes of Israel, right? And then the 2 tribes of the south took on the name of Judah because that was, of the 2 tribes, Judah and Benjamin, that was the largest. So the kingdom of Judah was the southern kingdom, and that was the one that Rehoboam continued to worship or to lead. And the only reason that they didn't secede from Rehoboam is because they said, because of David, because this is David's grandson, because of our respect for David, we're not going to rebel against Rehoboam, even though we hate him. Right? So it's kind of interesting how that worked out. I don't know, it reminds me of politics, right? So you got people in specific parties who don't like their leader, but because they're part of the party, they're showing respect, and they say, oh, we'll follow this guy even though we don't like him. Right? That's happening all the time. So that's what happened in Judah. They did that, but then Rehoboam was not a very smart king. And so here we got this pagan king, and his, Nebuchadnezzar learned his lesson, but Belshazzar is not going to learn his lesson. Okay, I think there was a third thing that I had written down about how Belshazzar showed contempt for Daniel. So he said he'd only heard of him. And he refuses to acknowledge Daniel's power. Okay, that's where he says in verse 14, "I have heard about the spirit of the gods in you, and that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom." But notice that he doesn't say, I know you have these things. He says, I've only heard that you've had these things.
He basically just repeats what the queen said. There's nothing really new from that paragraph that the queen said.
Yeah, well, except for the idea that she said that he had the spirit of the holy gods.
One word.
Yeah, so one word, but definitely he doesn't acknowledge the power of Daniel to interpret, right? Okay, because in the previous chapters we had Daniel actually did interpret the king's dream twice. The dream of the statue in chapter 2, the dream of the tree and statue, the dream of the tree in chapter 4. And so knowing that Daniel had done this in the past, here instead of saying, I know you can do this, he says, I've heard that you have insight, intelligence, and outstanding wisdom.
Yeah, but his mom, the queen, did say just that in the previous paragraphs. So I don't know.
Yeah, so maybe, okay, we've found the king.
He just
Well,
left
okay,
it out.
in verse 12 it says, this man Daniel, whom the king called Belteshazzar, was found to have a keen mind and knowledge and understanding, and also the ability to interpret dreams. So she said he has the ability to interpret dreams,
Right.
but when he says it, he doesn't actually include that. See, by what he excludes, we see that what his attitude is towards Daniel. So he doesn't want to acknowledge that Daniel has the ability to interpret dreams. And why? Because, first of all, he doesn't care about Daniel. He thinks of him as why would I lower myself to listen to an exile, a guy who, is a person from a conquered nation. So he already thinks of himself as better because he had conquered his country. So what does Daniel have to offer me? And we talked about this last week when we talked about how during World War II, because of Hitler's disdain for the Jewish people, he wouldn't even listen to the fact that the Jewish scientists were able to develop the atom bomb. If he wouldn't have kicked people like Einstein out, or if they wouldn't have left Germany, or if they would not have left Germany, and he would have listened to them, who knows what would have happened in World War II. Maybe Hitler would have won the war if he would have gotten the atom bomb earlier. But he didn't, because he rejected the scientists who were Jewish, who actually knew what they were talking about, right? It's the same thing here. It's to his own fault and his own destruction that Belshazzar rejects the idea that he should even call him. And actually, this comes back to another thing that is part of the text that I didn't cover yet. Let's see. Okay, in verse 15, I guess. Okay, so let's read verse 15, and I'll explain what I was going to say.
The wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read this writing and tell me what it means, but they could not explain it.
Okay, so Belshazzar, the king, is saying to Daniel, the wise men and enchanters were brought before me to read. So he's telling him, they couldn't figure it out. I'm going to have to, depend on you. Maybe because his mom told him to. That's why, right? But the literal translation of this verse says, it says the wise men who are soothsayers. It doesn't technically say the wise men and the enchanters are soothsayers. It says the wise men who are soothsayers. And remember that phrase that was translated in some of the places Chaldeans, and literally it was Chaldeans, and it was translated as what was that word as astrologers, right? So what he's actually saying is that his understanding of who the wise men were was exclusive. He only included people who were from his own country in the category of wise men. So by saying that, he was omitting Daniel. Daniel had been over the wise men at this point he's in his 80s, right? Daniel is an old man. He spent most of his life, over 70 years, maybe 66 years, because he was probably around 14 when he was taken into exile by Nebuchadnezzar. And then eventually he was placed over all the wise men, and he was like a ruler. And now his grandson is like, yeah, you're an old man. You're from a conquered nation, and you're inferior to me, and so I don't want to listen to you. But because my soothsayers who were Babylonians couldn't figure this out, I'm going to have to, stoop to listening to you. So there's a lot, by things that he's not saying, we see that he does have a lot of disdain. So his pride is on display here. And this is the reason why he's going to be judged, right? So he's not really considering Daniel as being anybody other than a guy who supposedly has done something like this in the past, but he doesn't really put a lot of effort into believing it. Again, it's probably because because of his own arrogance, he thought the people of Babylon were more intelligent than anyone else, and this is kind of it's a human trait, right? So every conquering nation believes that they're better than the people that they conquer, right? Human nature. And then people who are countries that are more successful seem to look down on countries that are poor. The poverty of other nations has nothing to do with their value, their worth, and their intelligence. All it proves is that they are not, they weren't the first people to get to that success. And because people who, have lots of money and control things, don't like to let go of it, right? And, this gets into all kinds of political theories and stuff like that. But God here is not making anything, is not talking about whether the Babylonian rulers are better than the Jewish rulers. After all, didn't God call Nebuchadnezzar to conquer his own people? And the reason was because God's in control, and he'll use one powerful nation to punish his nation in order to bring them to the point where, what do you think the whole point of the exile was? Yeah, to bring them back to faith. Because before the exile, they were worshiping idols in Jerusalem. And now Daniel is outside of Jerusalem, and he says, I'm only going to worship the true God, along with, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So the exile actually consolidated the faith of the Jewish people, whereas before their faith was kind of all over the place and worshiping idols and stuff like that. Okay, so we're going to continue with verse 16. Somebody read that?
Now the wise men and the enchanters have been, wait a minute, didn't we just read 15?
No, 16.
16. But I have heard that you can give interpretations and solve problems. Now, if you can read the writing and make known to me its interpretation, you shall be clothed with purple and have a chain of gold around your neck and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom.
Okay, so if he doesn't really respect Daniel, why is he willing to give him this blessing? The gold chain. There we go. He doesn't think he can do it, but he offered Daniel the same thing that he had previously offered to his own wise men. Like, if any of you can interpret this, I'll give you this. So that was something that he had said back in verse 7, right? Verse 7, he had offered that. So he's basically offering the same reward, but he doesn't really think he can do it. And the reason why we believe that is just because of the way that he was showing disrespect. So Belshazzar, didn't learn the lesson that his father learned. And what are some of the things that Belshazzar had done that showed his arrogance in the face of Daniel's God in the beginning of the chapter? Sometimes we don't realize how bad this is, but in verse 2, what did he do?
He was using the temple fittings in a party, right?
That's right. Okay, so using the sacred temple goblets that were used in the sacrifices for the altar for the sins of the people of Israel, right? They would offer a wine oblation. An oblation is a liquid offering onto the altar, right? And because he rejected the God of Israel, he showed it was sacrilege to use these sacred vessels for an orgy, really. And then not only that, but what was the icing on the cake of his arrogance? Verse 4 chapter 5, verse 4.
Drank a bunch of wine and.
Okay, well, drink.
praise,
Right. So drinking of the wine isn't as bad.
Objects of
Be-
things.
That's right. So they praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So giving praise and honor to false idols that don't exist and are just as mute and powerless as the very materials that they're made out of, right? So idols are made out of gold, silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone, and people worship those. And so he's giving praise to these things that are non-existent. And so we know that those things don't exist. And so God, how does God treat those who are going to worship idols, right? So first of all, it's not because God, when the Bible says God's a jealous God, we can't think of him like some jealous girlfriend who gets mad at anybody who looks at some other woman, right? I've always heard students in my Old Testament class who think that God's jealousy is a bad trait. Why doesn't he just get over it? Why is God so upset when other people worship anything else than him? Why? So jealousy, usually we think of jealousy as a bad thing, but there's such a thing as righteous jealousy, right? And so it's just like there's such a thing as a righteous war, fighting to defend freedom and innocent victims. There's such a thing as righteous jealousy. For instance, when a man and a woman get married, you absolutely do not have any intentions to believe that your spouse will date other people once you're married, because you've taken vows to each other that you would only be there for each other. You become one flesh, right? So, it's not wrong for a husband to be upset if his wife starts dating other people. To be jealous is to have a righteous jealousy, because he has the expectation that she is his only in a relationship. And so that would not be wrong for him to be upset for that. So the same thing with God. God made a covenant with Israel at Mount Sinai. God said, I will be your God and you will be my people. And in Jeremiah 31, it describes how God was a husband to his people Israel, and they were his bride. And so when they worshiped other gods, what they were doing is committing spiritual adultery. So for God to be jealous is really to say, you belong to me, and I'm not going to share you with someone else. And not because he needs them, but because for Israel to worship other gods is to lead themselves to go to hell and to be punished, because if they decide they want to live without God in this life, what happens when we die is God says, have it your way. You wanted to live your life without me, you can live eternity without me. So hell is really our decision, right? God doesn't send people to hell. He only chooses people for salvation. And people, their free will, can reject him and go to hell because they... And so when God's jealous, it's because he loves us, because he doesn't want us to go to hell. So God doesn't want Belshazzar to go to hell, but his rejection of the true God that's where his heart. He has already hardened his heart. In essence, he's like the Pharaoh with Moses, right? He's shown his disregard for God by taking the vessels that Nebuchadnezzar put in storage, right? Nebuchadnezzar feared the Lord enough to say, I've stolen these precious vessels, but I'm not going to desecrate them. I'm going to put them in a special place. In a way, he showed them honor by not destroying them, by not melting them down, and by keeping them for the future when the Jewish people would be able to return home. He didn't know this, but by doing it, he was playing out God's will, because God had predicted through Jeremiah that in 70 years they would return from the exile, and they would take the temple furnishings back, and they would restore the temple with the original temple furnishings. So all the stuff that was taken was brought back. We don't know what happened to the Ark of the Covenant, but it's possible that even the Ark of the Covenant was in hiding, or was in storage, that is, and was brought back. We don't know what would have happened to it, but we know that after 70 A.D., when the Romans destroyed Jerusalem, from that point on, there was no record of the Ark ever again in history. So we don't know what happened to it after the Romans destroyed it. But he probably took the Ark of the Covenant with him. And so here, these aren't just wine goblets. These are sacred elements. It'd be like, in the Middle Ages, one of the reasons why the priests would place the host in the mouth of the communicant was, does anybody know why? So, well, not just so their hand wouldn't touch it, so they wouldn't take it with them. What would people do in the Middle Ages with a piece of God? Because
Tried to do magic.
that's right. They tried to do magic. So the idea is that witches would take the host and use it in magic because it was a piece of God. So the church was teaching transubstantiation. So it looks like bread, but it's not. It's a piece of Jesus. So how powerful is a piece of Jesus in magic, right? So they would place it in the mouth and make sure that you ate it before they moved on to the next person, because this is what would happen. In the Middle Ages, even the Latin phrase for when the words of institution were said, hoc est corpus deum, this is the body, this is my body, right? And if you say it fast enough, what it turned into is hocus pocus. Hoc est corpus meum, this is my body, is what it says in Latin. But if you say it fast, it sounds like hocus pocus, because that's the whole idea of magic was a kind of it included this idea of the medieval view of what was happening in the church, and then trying to harness some of that power for yourself, right? So magic is trying to use spiritual power by yourself, or to manipulate spiritual power. Now, in the Bible, there's no such thing as magic when it comes to God's people, because God can't be manipulated, and that's one of the reasons why he allowed the Ark of the Covenant to be stolen by the Philistines, because he said the Ark is holy, but if the people of God aren't going to show him honor and love, then he's going to just let it be stolen. And it did. It got stolen. But they eventually turned it back because bad things happened to them in their temple when they did it. But the same thing happened under Jeremiah. Jeremiah told the people of Israel, don't think that you're safe because the temple is in Jerusalem. Because they said, oh, God won't let the Babylonians destroy the temple. It's his temple. Why would he let that happen? And God said, I don't care about the temple. I care about your relationship to me. And if you have rejected me, then I have to discipline you and let you be destroyed so that you can learn your lesson. So that's what the book of Daniel is showing, is that the people needed to learn a lesson, and then they're going to come back from the exile much better. Their faith will be much stronger. Okay, so so desecrating those temple, the temple goblets and instruments, I guess, is something that showed his disdain, whereas even Nebuchadnezzar didn't show that type of arrogance. Okay, so let's see in verse 17.
Then Daniel answered and said before the king, let your gifts be for yourself, and give your rewards to another. Nevertheless, I will read the writing to the king, and make known to him the interpretation.
Okay, so what is one of the things that you notice about the way Daniel talks to the king?
He doesn't really address him. He doesn't give any sort of honor with it. All he says, just calls him king.
That's right. So whereas Daniel showed a lot of respect for Nebuchadnezzar, like remember how he said, "O king, may you live forever," and he said, may this not be so. Remember when he was talking about one of the judgments about the tree being cut down? He says, "May this happen to your enemies and not to you." So why do you think he had more respect for Nebuchadnezzar but no respect for? I mean, he's not disrespectful because he does call him your majesty, right? But why do you think Daniel he's very curt and to the point and doesn't, go overboard with showing honor to Belshazzar?
Belshazzar says no honor to God.
There we go. Yeah. So the way that he treats God is the way that he treated Daniel, and so Daniel is kind of giving him back his own medicine. So he's because he wasn't showing respect to, and not because Daniel needs to be respected, but Daniel doesn't mince words here. He doesn't need the gifts. He doesn't need Belshazzar's approval, and so he's very short with him. So even though Daniel's not necessarily showing disrespect to Belshazzar, we see that that he is. He's going to be to the point, right? And so the next section, like verses 18 through 21, he's going to recap all of chapter 4 to Belshazzar, and then verses 22 through 22 through 23 are going to be, his description of what God wanted him to learn, that Nebuchadnezzar learned. In essence, he's kind of saying, your grandfather had learned his lesson, but you didn't, and so there's going to be some consequences for that. Okay, so let's see the next verse, 18.
O king, the Most High God gave Nebuchadnezzar your father kingship and greatness and glory and majesty.
Okay, so some translations may say your majesty, right? So he is showing respect to the king by calling him that, but notice that he mentions the Most High God, right? So that's the way that Nebuchadnezzar called the God of Israel, right? Because whenever God's listed, named in the Hebrew, usually is the word Lord with all capital letters, but that's actually God's name, right? So the name Yahweh. But because he's speaking to a pagan God who doesn't know who Yahweh is necessarily, he just uses the phrase Most High God, which is an equivalent to Yahweh. So he's saying there's only one God, and in a lot of ways he's saying that the only authority you have, Belshazzar, is the same authority that Nebuchadnezzar had, right? Nebuchadnezzar wasn't a conqueror. He only did what God called him to do, which was to punish the people of Israel because God was in control. So, and he's saying that Nebuchadnezzar actually learned this, right? All the greatness and glory and splendor of Nebuchadnezzar was something that it says God, the Most High God, gave to him. So he's saying your grandfather's authority to rule came from my God, the God of Israel, and yet you don't even realize that for yourself. So he's already he's starting to proclaim what the punishment is going to be. You disrespected the God of the universe, and whereas your grandfather understood it, and so he learned a lesson, but you don't. You're not. Okay. And also the words that he's using here, when he says, your father Nebuchadnezzar. Again, the reason why he calls him, it's not because he's mistaken. He knows that Nebuchadnezzar is not the literal father of Belshazzar, but he's kind of saying, you're cut out of the same cloth. You're in the same line. Your authority comes from the same place that Nebuchadnezzar's did. So it's not because he's mistaken, but it's because in the Hebrew or even the Aramaic, you can use the word father to mean something like an ancestor or whatever. But he also uses the same phrases that are used in chapter 4, right? He talks about Nebuchadnezzar, about his sovereignty, his greatness, his glory, and his splendor. Those 4 words are the words that are used of Nebuchadnezzar back in chapter 4. So the way that he's describing Nebuchadnezzar is really just a summary of what happened in chapter 4. Okay,
Daniel's he's talking down to
Belshazzar, yeah.
Almost kind of parochial or just scolding him.
Exactly.
It goes on and on.
Right, exactly.
So he's not showing him any respect.
Yeah, because what he's going to do, he already knows that the interpretation of what he's going to tell him is a judgment. So there's no need to flatter or to butter him up, because it's all going to come down as a bad thing for Belshazzar. And it's interesting that even after he gets the judgment, that Belshazzar basically says, I'm still going to honor you. That might have been because he had already said he was going to do it. Remember last week in our the gospel for Sunday was the beheading of John the Baptist, and so that's right. Herod said he was going to do something. He was going, I'll give you whatever you want. And so when his daughter or stepdaughter, wants the head of John the Baptist on the platter, he feels like he has to go ahead and do it. So probably the same thing. And just imagine the kind of pride that causes you to do something that you don't want to do, but you do it anyways. So it might be immoral. It might be, it might be wrong or distasteful, but your pride is stronger than your sense of right and wrong. So it means that his pride is overriding his consciousness. And so that's what he's going to do. He's going to show honor to Daniel and give him all the rewards, even though he just told him a judgment. And in the ancient world, a lot of times, what would happen to a prophet who told judgment to a king? Yep, they would kill him, right? I don't want to hear that, and they'd kill him.
That meant we're thrown into a dry well.
That's right, yeah. So like Jeremiah was persecuted and almost killed several times, but he didn't actually get killed. God told him that he would protect him. But a lot of the prophets, like Elijah, was chased down by Queen Jezebel and King Ahab. He was almost killed. And but the Bible tells us that many of the prophets were killed because of their message. So this is kind of miraculous that Daniel is not going to be killed. And the only reason we can understand this is because God was protecting him. Okay, next verse 19.
Because of the high position he gave him, all the peoples and nations and men of every language dreaded and feared him. Those the king wanted to put to death, he put to death. Those he wanted to spare, he spared. Those he wanted to promote, he promoted. And those he wanted to humble, he humbled.
Okay, so when you compare this section, 18 through 21, with chapter 4, which is, remember I said it was a summary? This is the only unique section that is not mentioned in chapter 4 at all. Nowhere in the rest of Daniel does it say that God gave Nebuchadnezzar the ability to do these things. Even, it's still true. It's just that this is not, he's not quoting from chapter 4, whereas the other sections he was. So what do you think is the point of Daniel telling Belshazzar that Nebuchadnezzar had the ability, first of all, he says that all the other countries and other kings feared him, and that Nebuchadnezzar had the power to put people to death, to spare people, to promote people, and to humble people. So those 4 verbs there.
Getting ready for the word but in verse 20 because he became arrogant.
Yeah, right. So he's describing the authority that Nebuchadnezzar had, which was very powerful. And Nebuchadnezzar came to the realization, again, this is in verse 20, right? That all that authority came from where?
Came from God.
Yeah, from the God of the universe. And so this is where he's like telling him, well, didn't you learn anything from your grandfather? He was the most powerful man in the country or in the world, and the God of the universe humbled him, and you didn't even learn this. So he's really going into the detail about the kinds of things that Nebuchadnezzar was able to do in order to show the impact on Belshazzar that he should have learned this lesson. Okay, and there may be some other maybe reasons for the details about he had the ability to put people to death. He spared people. So think about previously in the book of Daniel, who did King Nebuchadnezzar try to put to death? Remember? Yeah, the 3 young men who were thrown into the fiery furnace. I mean, there's no reason to believe that he thought that they would survive that, right? So he put them to death, but then they didn't die. And then who did he spare? Well, Daniel could have been killed several times, like when he first came before he was going to be killed. Remember when Nebuchadnezzar was angry because he had a dream, and he insisted that the wise men tell him what the dream was and then interpret it. Nobody could do it, so he said they're all going to be killed. And then Daniel was going to be killed with him. But then when Daniel, as a young boy, this is back in chapter 2, said to the king, he says, "Can you interpret my dream?" And he says, "No, but the God of the universe can." And then he asked him for some time, which was kind of unusual because he got so angry at the Babylonian wise men for asking for time because they were purposely trying to buy time. He said, "I can do this, but I need to seek my God's answer." And so he spared him. So the sparing of Daniel in chapter 2 might be one of the reasons why he mentions that. And then who did he promote? All 4 of them, Daniel and the 3 young men, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, at the end of chapter 3, after the statue debacle, he after he finds out that they didn't die in the fiery furnace, then he promotes all 4 of those guys. Okay, so in essence, these 4 verbs are talking about what happened to Daniel and the other Jewish leaders, and then the 4th one, and who he humbled. So maybe Nebuchadnezzar tried to humble people, like the whole people, all the people he conquered. But this is going to come also to the fact that God was going to do the same thing to him. So in verse 20, we're going to find out about what Nebuchadnezzar tried to do by humbling people. God's going to do to him. Okay, so verse 20.
But when his heart became arrogant and hardened with pride, he was disposed from his royal throne and stripped of his glory.
Right, and so that's what happened at the end of chapter 4, where Nebuchadnezzar became like a wild animal, and it doesn't say that this happened until a point that happened. So God had used him, and Nebuchadnezzar destroyed Jerusalem because that was God's purpose. But what's the difference between Nebuchadnezzar destroying Jerusalem and now it says he became arrogant? Wasn't he always arrogant? Right? Now, there's a difference between his being arrogant and what it says here, and hardened with pride. Think about Pharaoh in Egypt in the book of Exodus, right? So in the 10 plagues, the first 5 plagues, it tells us how Moses would go before the Pharaoh and he would say, "Let my people go," says the Lord. And then what would the Pharaoh do? No, actually he did. He says, "I'll let them go." The first 5 times, I'll let them go. But before they left, he changed his mind. And then when you get to after the 5th time, there's a change. So what's the first 5 times, Pharaoh hardened his heart. But the 6th time on, what does the Bible tell us? God hardened his heart. Now, does that is there really any difference between you hardening your heart and God hardening your heart? I would say that the difference is that God gave him opportunities to repent in the first 5 times, which he almost did, because he said, "I'll let him go," but then he changed his mind. But when God hardens your heart, then what it does is he takes away the possibility of the gospel, because one of the things that Pharaoh said after the 5th time is, I never want you to see you again. He said this to Moses. And so Moses actually had gone straight to the Pharaoh for the first 5 times. But from the 5th time on, or the 6th through the 10th time, Pharaoh never saw Moses again. So the instrument by which God's grace was being delivered to the Pharaoh was through Moses, the prophet. But then by refusing to see him ever again, he was cutting himself off from the means of grace. And by doing that, your heart gets hardened. So what lesson does that show us in our life as Christians? How do we cut ourselves off from the means of grace? By not going to communion, by not reading God's word. We can say we have faith, but when we've cut ourselves off from that, then we are relying on ourselves. And the danger is that our hearts can be hardened.
We're not getting fed.
Yeah, right. So you spiritually starve to death. And when you're starved to death, then you spiritually die. And when you're spiritually dead, you're in essence hardened against God's grace. So, maybe that's going too far for King Belshazzar, because he never was a believer. But the evidence of the God of the universe was there in his own kingdom, in the person of Daniel, and also in the evidence of his grandfather Nebuchadnezzar, who had humbled himself and said, "Oh yeah, the God of Israel is the greatest God of all." But here, Belshazzar is not, learning any of these things. So, let's see. Now, so in verse 20, is he talking about? Let's see. When his heart began. Yeah, so he's talking about Nebuchadnezzar, right? So Nebuchadnezzar had gone to the point where he conquered the people of Israel, and he was already arrogant, but by hardening his heart, he started to believe that he was greater than the God of Israel. And that's when God turned him into like a wild animal. So that's what he's going to tell us. He says that he deposed him, his royal throne, he stripped away his glory. In verse 21, he's going to give us more details about this. Somebody read verse 21.
He was driven away from the people and given the mind of an animal. He lived with the wild donkeys and ate grass like cattle. And his body was drenched with the dew of the heaven, until he acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign over all the kingdoms of men and sets over them anyone he wishes.
So, verse 21 is again a summary of the end of chapter 4 of Daniel, with one exception. Right? So in that chapter 4 it tells us that God drove Nebuchadnezzar away from the people, and he was given like a mind of an animal. Remember, there was a type of psychological insanity or disorder where people start to think that they're an animal. So what did I call that before? Anthropy or something. But here he adds another detail that wasn't in that chapter. Do you see what the difference is? It's just very small.
The boy sure goes on to chew out Belshazzar.
Yes, right. So he's going to show him that you should have learned from your grandfather. It's so the section that's a unique detail to this section that's not found in chapter 4 was he lived with the wild donkeys, right? That's just one difference between, because elsewhere in chapter 4 it says that Nebuchadnezzar ate grass like cattle, that his body was drenched with the dew of the heavens. That's just a detail that describes that he was like living outside, right, instead of living inside of a palace. And to eat grass like cattle, means that he's kind of been domesticated, he's acting like a domesticated animal. So he was in charge of everybody, but now he's acting like something that is being, that a person who has cattle drives them to where they want, and so now you're under the control of somebody else. So perhaps the detail of the description of living with the wild donkeys is to show. There's two aspects of his humiliation, right? So cattle are like under the control of other people, and then wild donkeys don't seem to be under control of anybody. One is a domesticated animal, one's a wild animal, but in essence they're both not very strong and are susceptible to enemies, right? So wild donkeys can be killed by bears and lions and stuff like that, and just because they're wild doesn't mean they're any safer. And cattle in some ways might be safer because they're usually in a corral or they're watched by herdsmen or whatever, but because they're domesticated, they're not their own masters. So he's just throwing this extra detail in to show an extra aspect of his humiliation, which Belshazzar should have understood and learned, but he doesn't. And he tells us that until, that is, Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged that the Most High God is sovereign, that's when he was able to get over that insanity. And that very last sentence where he says that he gives the kingdoms of men over to anyone he wishes. If you remember in chapter 4, what was the original description of that? Daniel, when he interpreted the dream of Nebuchadnezzar, didn't just say that God gives the kingdoms of men to anyone he wishes. He actually says he gives the kingdoms of men to the person who's the humblest of all. Who do you think that was a description of? So the idea that, remember the kingdom that Nebuchadnezzar imagined in the dream of the statue, it says that a rock came and struck the foot of the statue. That was in chapter 2, and the whole of the statue was destroyed. And then that rock grew into a mountain, and that mountain represented a kingdom, the kingdom of the coming Messiah. So the description of that God gives the kingdoms of men to anyone he wishes, back in chapter 4, he actually said it gives, look at chapter 4, verse 17. So the original interpretation of Daniel of the dream of Nebuchadnezzar said that the Most High God is sovereign over the kingdoms of men and gives them to anyone he wishes and sets over them the lowliest of men. So he added a phrase in the original interpretation that was pointing to who the Messiah would be. The Messiah wouldn't just be anybody, but he would be the lowliest of men. So that's why when Jesus came, he came riding on a donkey into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday. He was crucified, whipped, and then died as a criminal. And so all those things show that Jesus was the humblest of all, but God gave him, after he rose from the dead, he sat at the right hand of God, and he became the judge over the living and the dead, whose kingdom will have no end. So here in Daniel chapter 5, verse 21, what we're doing is this is a foreshadowing of what's going to happen in the rest of the book of Daniel. Because when you get to Daniel chapter 7, he's going to actually tell us who is that person that God sets the kingdoms of the world over. Who he's going to give the kingdoms of the world to, that is. And who is that? That's right. In Daniel chapter 7, verse 13, he says, "One like a son of man came before the throne of the Most High God, and he was worshipped. And then he was given all authority to judge, and his kingdom will have no end." So Daniel's going to actually see the vision of the Messiah in chapter 7, whereas in chapter 4 and 5, he's only giving us the prophecy of the coming Messiah's kingdom. So Belshazzar, he should have known some of these details. It's not like they were secrets. They were known to his grandfather, probably to his own father, Nabonidus, and here he refuses to acknowledge the idea that his authority came from God, the God of Israel, that his grandfather acknowledged the God of Israel, but he won't do it himself. Okay, verse 22.
And you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, though you knew all this.
So again, this just goes to show that Daniel is stating what Belshazzar refused to acknowledge earlier in the chapter, like when we looked at verses 14 and 15, where he doesn't know, he acts like he didn't know who Daniel was, or he doesn't seem to think he had any interpretation powers. And then he hits him between the eyes. You knew these things, and you didn't humble yourself. So just like God hardened the heart of Pharaoh, in essence, he hardens the heart of Belshazzar because of his refusal to acknowledge who the true ruler is.
I kind of get the feeling from the way Daniel was talking about Nebuchadnezzar that he was sort of comparing Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar wasn't coming out very well in comparison anyway.
That's right, yeah.
You were a lesser man than your grandfather was, and yet, he acknowledged God's sovereignty and you don't.
Yes, right. So when we talk about comparison in the Bible, in the Hebrew, there's three types of parallelism. There's synonymous, so comparing and showing how they're alike. There's antithetical, which shows that it's showing the complete opposites, right? For instance, like Psalm 1 says that the one who walks in the paths of the wicked will be destroyed, but the one who is the righteous person who walks in righteous paths is like a tree planted beside living waters, right? So that's a complete opposite. One is like going down the path of death, and the other one's living by the river of life, right? So the complete opposites. So, and then the third type of comparison is called synthetic, where you have a comparison where the second comparison goes a little bit further beyond the first one. But yeah, so this is antithetical, it's a contrasting. And so he's not saying, you're just like your grandfather. He's actually saying you're not anything like your grandfather.
You're
Yeah.
really not.
Yeah, you are a lesser man. Well, and just imagine, because Belshazzar called himself the son of Nebuchadnezzar, in a way trying to say, I'm just as good as he is, whereas Daniel is saying, you're nothing like he is. Because the fact that Nebuchadnezzar acknowledged the God of the universe at all, that changed sure, he was an evil man, and sure, he was a pagan and a polytheist, but at least he acknowledged who the true God is, and Belshazzar isn't even willing to do that. When he saw the writing on the wall, remember what happened to him? It's talked about how sometimes we can go over the details without thinking about it. It says that his knees knocked together, and he was frightened, and his legs gave way.
And his color changed.
Yeah. So, I mean, how do you think that description shows what had happened to him? I mean, he wasn't an old man. He wasn't unable to stand. But the fact that his knees knocked and his legs gave way, he couldn't even stand before the authority. So he was so frightened he was knocked to his feet. And so it shows that that instead of having the fear of God, like the word Proverbs tells us in Proverbs 1 verse 7, the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. He had a fear of God because he rejected God. So he was afraid of God, not showing reverence to God. And so this is why he's being judged. See, the difference between the fear of God, which is a good thing, and the fear of God, which is a bad thing, is the difference of who you see God as. If you see God as your Father, then to fear God is to show respect to him because you love him and he loves you. If you don't love God, then how do you see God? Not as your Father, but as a judge. And when you get in trouble, judges throw you in jail. So the judgment is coming, and he doesn't have any fear of God as a father, but instead he's afraid of God because of the judgment that's going to happen to him. Okay, so
Pastor,
yeah.
we better.
Yeah. Okay. So let's wrap this up. In fact,
I'm so sorry, because we gotta hit the road.
right. So we're gonna start next week with verse 23. So we'll stop here.
Thank you.